why do we make games? Why do people get off of their jobs as firemen and teachers and accountants and go home and spend the last little bits of their energy on painting, on photography, on writing stories that maybe nobody will ever read? This isn't like a nihilist thought experiment. It's just something I've been thinking a lot about recently. Why is it that when I have time to myself and sufficient energy, that the thing that I choose to do is sit down and work on games? There are probably as many valid answers to this question as there are people who make things on the planet. Some of them as simple as it's fun, that creativity is play, that our motivations for making games is almost identical to our motivation for playing games. That experimentation and curiosity and learning and growth and tests of skill are all elements of what makes creativity so inherently satisfying. But I think there's so much more to it than that. I think having that kind of passion about anything, the kind that leads you to destroying your sleep schedule, is a huge part of what makes life worth living. The last couple years, I've spent an arguably unhealthy amount of my free time on learning to make games. And I've done things in service of this obsession that remind me of my relationship to games. I've stayed up later than I should working on projects. I've had countless cups of coffee on an innumerable number of nights long after the sun went down. There's an incredibly strong sense that accompanies these all-night sessions that I can only describe as, this is what I'm supposed to be doing. Because it's been so long since I did one of these videos, and because this series started when I started learning game development more seriously, I feel like the obvious structure for this video is to talk about the projects that I've worked on, to talk about which ones I have hope for in the future, which ones I've finished and which ones I've abandoned, to fill the entire runtime with before and after comparison shots. But as I sifted through my footage from the last year of game development and started working on the outline for this video, it felt like there was something more important to talk about than just show and telling a bunch of these projects. The last devlog I made was about finishing things, about not just prototyping and playing and learning, but refining and polishing, about learning difficult lessons, the kind that can only be learned by seeing a project through to the end. I've tried to prototype and explore and iterate upon ideas that seem interesting without getting attached to them. I've tried to be skeptical of any idea as potentially and almost definitely overscoped in its initial form. And I've tried to see the good ideas through. I've tried to do justice to my initial excitement about those ideas. And a couple of these games I've even finished and put in front of other people. But in so doing, I have committed one of the cardinal sins of the aspiring game developer, which is to show those games only to friends and loved ones. I know that in order to become a better game developer, you need to put games in front of people who are strangers, who have no bias, who will be the most openly critical of them and probably the most objective. I know that this is important. And I guess part of what I'm trying to talk about here is that I am getting close to the threshold where that will become a part of the process. I have multiple projects that I'm excited about enough that I want to put them in other people's hands and let them play with them, and have the opportunity to hear from other people what they like and dislike about these ideas, to hear what about these experiences makes them curious, what they'd like to do and see within them, and also what confuses or frustrates them, and assess whether that confusion or frustration is desirable or fixable. I feel like that's a super healthy and necessary part of making games. But as I feel myself approaching escape velocity from the safety of the cocoon of someone who's just learning, and entering the new and vulnerable territory of, I take this seriously, tell me what you think, I think there are things that are important to me and important to what I value about making games that are things that I'd like to try to bring with me into this next phase. I feel like the thing that I'm most eager to talk about is that the relationship that I have to game dev is one that I really like. I've had experiences before where publicly sharing creative projects I've worked on has changed my relationship to those projects. When I started getting more serious about the music I was making around the time Noclip started, I feel like I got so in my head about the idea of releasing music, and whether people would like it or not, or whether there was an audience for that kind of music, that it changed the way that I was making music. It changed the music that I was making. And I think that this is one of the worst things that can possibly happen to a creative person, is that the act of creativity no longer becomes about the joy of creation itself, that it's no longer an exploration, no longer something done out of love or reverence, but out of obligation. That's not to downplay the production phase of a creative project, where you're no longer playing around and exploring and you're just honing in and making the thing. I recognize that that's a reality, but what I'm talking about is getting to a point where whether you're in the ideation phase or the iteration or production or refinement phases, that the proverbial door to the studio is open, and an imaginary audience is shouting their thoughts in through the open door. At that time in my life, I sent off a bunch of music to musicians that I really liked and respected, producers whose music I listened to on a daily basis. And I got some really positive feedback. In fact, there was one guy who ran a small independent label, and he seemed interested in potentially releasing something down the road. At the time, this seemed like a dream come true. It planted a seed in me that maybe music wasn't just something that I did for the joy of it, but that it could be something that sustained me someday. That the unstoppable torrential downpour of my excitement about music could someday have a water wheel stuck into it. But this process really damaged my relationship to music. I became increasingly analytical about the process and increasingly doubtful about my own capabilities. It felt like instead of sitting down to make music because I loved making music, I was putting an unbearable amount of pressure on these sessions, where I had to make something to continue proving that I was worthwhile. I think the most ironic thing about this is that the best pieces of art that I've made in my entire life weren't things where I sat down to make some important work. They were just things where I took the pressure off and tried to make something, to try to get excited about an idea and print it out from my brain into some tangible form. Like this frog model started because I was just looking at pictures of frogs, and I posted it one night on a whim while having drinks and woke up the next day to find that hundreds of people had liked it, which is like a really good and validating feeling. As much as the creative stuff that I work on is for me, I'd be lying if I told you there wasn't something life-affirming about sharing a piece of art you made and having people resonate with it. It's like whatever kind of creative output you have, whatever medium you're working in, the things that you make are in some sense a reflection of some hidden part of you. Not the exterior of our personalities that people encounter in conversation, but a more private version of you. The version of you that you are when you're by yourself. I don't know, maybe this won't resonate with everyone, but there's something that to me feels like when you share a piece of art with other people, you're like taking a leap of faith where you're showing them some secret part of yourself. And to take that risk and not get totally burned up in the process, but instead have people be like, yeah, that's cool. There's something about that that's like de-alienating to me. But I think there's a risk in creative work of being overly anticipatory of this phase of the process, of thinking too hard about how your work will be received. To be honest, I even struggled with what to say in this video. I've really liked the other Jayne Dev videos that I've put out, and so there's an unconscious pressure I'm putting on myself to have this video like fit with those videos or be a continuation of what they're about or whatever. But maybe it's a sign that I'm finally learning my lesson about making stuff, that I'm just trying to make something like honest and vulnerable right now. And not only that, but I also think it's reflective of the fact that my feelings about game dev have changed. When this series started, I was just messing around and showing off cool things that I had made. Now I've actually put serious time into a more ambitious project, and so I'm hesitant to share that until it's actually ready to share. Which is why, with the exception of a few clips in this video, I'm mostly not showing footage of what I've been working on recently. I thought this series might evolve into a semi-regular update in which I showed off the things that I was working on at the moment. But as I've come to take this more seriously and devote myself to one larger project, I guess I've come to feel that there's more value in trusting that feeling that I'll know when it's ready to share. And I guess I'm less interested in documenting that process step by step than I am having a good relationship to that process itself. And I think through the process of making and sharing tiny games, I think I'm finally realizing I actually really do value sharing stuff with other people. A lot of the time I try to tell myself that the stuff I'm working on is just for me, because it feels like there's some sense of like purity or authenticity in that. That when it comes to our private creative lives, we should make things for ourselves. Not out of like an anti-social rejection of other people's perspectives, but because it creates an honesty in the process that produces better works. And because it's more sustainable, because the motivation is intrinsic. But in making small games for friends and loved ones the last year and a half, in making my first networked multiplayer prototype and firing it up with friends back in Boston, I've realized that like the hard, rigid, organizational work involved in finishing larger projects is something that seems worthwhile to me, even as it gets away from like the playful exploration that I love about creative stuff. I guess I've finally found my own motivation for wanting to buckle down and finish things to show other people. Not just tiny games made in the space of a weekend, but a true honest stab at making something ambitious, something that I feel like is worth sharing. Not because I have to, but because I genuinely value doing so. because finishing small things and putting them in front of people I know has been a more rewarding part of the process than I guess I had anticipated. That not only the making of things gives my life a sense of purpose, but that sharing those things with other people is also a profoundly deep source of purpose for me. And to honor this realization, I've also committed myself to doing some smaller game jams along the way. To take breaks from this larger project and commit myself to just making something in 72 hours and throwing it out into the world. Honestly, it feels like the majority of the last couple of years has just been building enough skill in enough areas that I can actually make things that I feel like are cool and worth the time of anyone to check out. But even in this process of getting more serious, I want to hold on to what I think is a valuable part of the naivete of a beginner game designer. That wild-eyed ambition that dares to dream about types of games that nobody has ever made. I want to prioritize making games because I think that there are interesting, unexplored ideas in the medium of games. And because I love it. Like, as much as that aforementioned production phase is an important part of making games, all of that stems from an initial genuine excitement for exploring cool ideas in games. To be totally transparent with you, I've struggled a lot with making this video because it felt like a good opportunity to put a suit and tie on some of the games I've been making, and present them in public for the first time, to drag them out of the privacy of my office into the burning sunlight of the internet. But if it's okay with you, I'd kind of just like to talk more casually about what the journey has been like. The thing that I've without a doubt spent the most time on the last year or so was getting better at modeling and texture painting. It's also something that I think is really important for making games. I think aesthetic is more than just the cosmetic element of a video game. It communicates something about the game. It communicates tone and feeling and emotion and atmosphere. And it's admittedly the thing that gets me interested in a lot of games in the first place. And so learning to make competent 3D models and find a style of my own felt like a really important part of this process. And it's also just something that I really genuinely, inherently enjoy for its own sake. But a good aesthetic means very little without gameplay to back it up. So I've also spent countless hours this last year pushing myself technically, making throwable, climbable rope systems, save systems, inventory systems, dialogue systems, combat systems, testing out ideas for third-person shooters, turn-based RPGs, strategy games, colony sims, creating the bare bones for these ideas and seeing if I can design them into something interesting. I've made marching cube-based tunneling systems that allow the player to dig endlessly into a procedurally generated mesh. That one in particular I'm very proud of. I have a game idea surrounding that one that I'm pretty excited about, so watch your fucking back, Deep Rock Galactic. I'm just kidding, Deep Rock Galactic is a really good game. This is also the first project that I've integrated netcode into in any capacity, which has been one of the most delightful things I could imagine. Not only is it a good way to get feedback, but also playing with somebody gave me so many ideas for new gameplay mechanics. And it's also just so genuinely fun and rewarding to watch somebody enjoy the thing that you're making. The mantle system, You shot me in the side of the head.
That's my favorite thing to do now.
Maybe the best example of this is the few games that I actually did finish in the last year or so. I've made a couple tiny RPGs as presents, which is not only a good way to show somebody that you care about them, but also a great opportunity to test out making a dialogue system. Making a game for one specific person you know is also a fun opportunity to just do weird shit. This game in particular features a Vocaloid musical number. Working on projects so small and so personal feels like it allowed me to give myself permission to explore like a rougher and weirder and less polished side of game dev as well. So I feel like that's actually been like a really positive fringe benefit of doing those. Not only to make a deadline for a finished project and stick to it, but to do so with a level of privacy that feels like it allowed me to explore ideas I might otherwise not. But charging headlong into buffoonishly overscoped projects has also taught me some of the most important lessons of the last year. And so none of it feels like time wasted. It's not only like range-finding experience in which I actually figure out what kind of things I can make, but I also just think it's been a very good organic way to learn game design. To build the kinds of systems that I think would be interesting in a large open world. And then to ask, what do these systems mean in the absence of that large open world? Are they inherently interesting activities, or are they just passable ones that'd be more interesting in a more interesting context? To teach myself to keep returning to that ever-important question, what is the player doing and why is it interesting? And running hopelessly up against this obstacle time and time again is the thing that has coaxed me into learning how to design smaller ideas. Out of the friction between my wildest ambitions for games I'd like to make and the actual limitations on what's not only possible but feasible, I feel like out of this tension, some of the ideas that I'm most excited about have emerged. I think one of the big challenges of solo dev is challenging your notion of what a game can be, and getting pretty radical about design decisions that allow you to take these bigger ideas and scope them down into something manageable, and to actually figure out for myself, what types of games do I like to make? I think having like a very sincere and straightforward relationship to game dev, even once I start thinking about other people playing the games I'm working on, is something that's really important to me and something that I want to try to carry on into the future, even if I'm more public about sharing things. I think that if you make things that you genuinely care about, that other people will care about them too. And that is the guiding light that I try to hold on to in any sort of creative work that I do. And so, while the original version of this video was the equivalent of a baker showing you a bowl full of flour, sugar, eggs, and chocolate and explaining that someday they would be cookies, and if you squint at them in the right way, you could kind of see how they look like cookies. I hope it's okay that this was just more of like a emotional check-in about making games, about creativity in general. I feel like that's what the other Jayne Dev videos have all become anyway. But making games has become an incredibly important part of my life. It's something that I've always wanted to do, and I told myself I couldn't. It's something that I want to maintain a very authentic and sustainable relationship to, while also pouring myself into it with everything that I have. And I think I would regret it forever if I didn't give that a shot. I appreciate you coming along for this like neurotic, introspective roller coaster, and I wish you the best of luck in whatever it is that you care about the most. In whatever part of your life that means enough to you that you'll function on 5 hours of sleep the next day in order to make room for it. And finally, that I'll have something to show you at some point soon. Something that means enough to me that I think it's worth taking the risk of sharing it with other people.